for historians, for politicians, for diplomats, for business people, to predict what's going to happen in the Mediterranean in the years ahead. All we know is that we are not going to have more of the same. Things are really going to change. They are already changing, and we're at a very turbulent time when the old order is dying and the new order is not yet born. So this is why there's so much uncertainty, there's so much turbulence. What is very clear is that not just in the Mediterranean, but in the whole world at large, and I think when we discuss the Mediterranean, not to be Mediterranean-centric and think that the Mediterranean is the center of the world, but definitely as a global sea, what happens there reflects a lot also what happens in the world at large. We will, not just in the Mediterranean, but in the world, it will be impossible for any major power, whoever it is, to impose its hegemony on the rest of the world. So we are moving towards a world where it won't be a one-size-fits-all. And this kind of fragmentation, the question to ask then is what new order or what new disorder is going to take its place? Are we going to have hostile blocs competing with each other and against each other? Or will we manage somehow or other to keep a minimum universal framework as was dreamt after the Second World War, but which has now irrevocably broken down? Up to you, Jacob.
Thanks, Evarist, so much for that introduction. So I think what I'd like to touch on and kind of link maybe your speech to my questions is maybe your background as an educator. And you were Minister of Education for many years. And so I wondered if that influenced the way you approach your new brief. Did you kind of come at foreign affairs with a particular sense of wanting to have a theory of world politics, or maybe try and question and reinterpret some of the more standard, more typical ways of doing foreign policy? So is there some connection between background as an educator and how you approach foreign policy?
Well, I found it without thinking about it, though, because being for many long years in education, I found that one of the challenges we had to face, apart from trying to keep in touch with the changes in the world so that we will be educating, hopefully for today, preferably for tomorrow, but not for yesterday, as unfortunately is usually the case. But one of the biggest challenges was bullying. And I found that trying to address bullying in the playground and in the classroom and in the schools, I think prepared me quite a bit to see how we can address bullying in international affairs, because we have a lot of nice words in the Charter of the United Nations about the equality of nations, about major powers and small countries being equal and living together, and the international rule of law, and how we should all respect each other's sovereignty and territorial integrity. But then you find that even within your own bloc, for example, in our case in the European Union, there is subtle bullying, sometimes not so subtle. Even though, and this brings me to one of my favorite stories, which I keep on talking about over and over again because it taught me a lot, is the Mellieha dialogue. When with the Athenians and the Spartans were at each other, they visited the small island. The Athenians visited the small island of Melos and said, you must join the war on our side. Melos wanted to be neutral because, as a small island, they wanted to live with both powers. And the Athenians told them, you shouldn't have any such illusions. The powerful do what they want. The weak, the small, must obey what the others tell them. 2,300 years have passed, and the Mellieha dialogue is still very strong in the world. And I can tell you from my own personal experience, what hurts most is not when you are bullied by those who would be traditionally considered from the other camp, but when you are bullied from inside your own camp. And I can tell you, it has happened, and it does happen, and it's very important, and this is a point I'd like to really, really stress for young diplomats. We must be open-minded. We must be evidence-based in the facts that we get together very patiently, but we must have self-respect. We must have dignity. If we don't respect ourselves, others will not respect us. We must stand up for what we believe in, not in any fanatical way, and not simply to cause problems for others, but because we need to express our voice. We must have professional humility, but not accept to be humiliated. And the last point I want to make again is this. Obviously, we live in a world where the most powerful centers in the world produce the most knowledge and information about the world. And it's not the first time that countries outside the core get their information and their pictures of themselves. They allow themselves to be defined by the powerful. And I think that that is a mistake. So it's good that we are open-minded and that we read and consult as many different sources as possible, but we must always try to do all we can to keep our intellectual independence. So unless we are intellectually independent and unless we have self-respect, we will simply be followers.
Thanks, Evarist. So to follow on from that, I'd like to ask, because we have a mixed audience, some Maltese and some international people listening. So yeah, how would you define Malta and its place in the world? Do you think that necessarily like a Maltese foreign policy or the way Malta behaves internationally will be shaped by its identity as, number one, a small island state, and number two, post-colonial state? And do you think that's necessarily the case, or do you think that a country like Malta should try and buck those labels, or is it simply the way that other countries will always relate to a place like Malta?
Now, we have moved forward as a country when we have had self-respect and a sense of dignity, and as small countries, we cannot afford to dream small. We have to dream big. Now, in the case of us, dreaming big is not to run the world or to have, illusions of influencing what happens in the rest of the world, but as much as possible, modifying how the rest of the world affects us. But always keeping in mind that we must think of our own development, socio-economic development, within an international framework. In the case of Malta, I smile when I hear about discussions of globalization, whether the world is still globalizing or whether we are deglobalizing, whether now we are regionalizing. In the case of Malta, for us, globalization is not an ideological discussion. It is a necessity. We practically import everything and we export everything. So in our case, not only are we one of the smallest states in the world, I mean, we are the smallest state in the European Union, but we were also one of the smallest states in the world. But at the same time, we have among the most open and exposed economy in the world. So in our case, we must be very attentive to what happens in the rest of the world, because it's not happening in the rest of the world, it's happening in Malta. And it's happening in Malta because I think, and it's not a cliche, that today whatever happens is global. It's local, definitely it's local, but it's also global. So what we need to do, I hear about be careful not to be the mouse that roars. No, we must not be either the mouse that roars or think that we are a lion, pretend to be a lion to roar and frighten the others. That would be ridiculous. But definitely, we need to have a sense of self-respect and a sense of dignity. we became independent. You know, there are over 3,000 islands in the Mediterranean. There are only two sovereign states, Malta and Cyprus. At least in the case of us, although we have had quite our own political rivalries and tensions, and I think Freud had us in mind when he wrote about the narcissism of small differences, because in Malta, because of our political culture, even when we agree, we would like to say that we disagree. But at least we have kept together as a community, as a nation state. Unfortunately, in Cyprus, this is not the case. And if you are following the news, the tension now is going to really get high because the United States has decided to start selling arms to the Republic of Cyprus and obviously the northern Turkish community. I mean, a new tension. So in our case, because our people have dreamed big to run ourselves, if this hadn't happened, Jacob, Malta will be just 3 big rocks beyond, and not that big, beyond Sicily. We know what has happened to Greek islands who have lost. You know, it is quite ironic and painful to study the history of the Mediterranean and find that the birth of Greece, for example, as a nation state, started in the small island of Hydra. Sicily had a great say in the birth of Italy. Once the center of power moved to the continent, they became the periphery. And no country, no island, no community can afford to be a periphery, because once others are deciding for you, not because they necessarily want to be cruel to you, but they think of their own interests. So it's not a matter of punching above our weight. We have to have the dignity of speaking up. A lot of states around the world are small states. For example, in my case, I am really inspired by the Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley. Mia Mottley is a very smart woman, very intelligent, believes in the fact that small states should be respected, and speaks up for them and tells the big states, listen, you have a lot of power to look after yourselves. We have soft power, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't use that soft power to speak up for our country. And it's interesting, and I'll end on this note, that a lot of global initiatives that have to do with international rule of law and with the international order come from small states. I'll give you an example of Malta. The rule of the law of the sea, the UNCLOS. UNCLOS was born in Malta because it is in our interest that the common goods, the resources of the world are considered the common heritage of mankind. Interesting that the idea of the International Court, of the International Criminal Court, was the idea of the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, another small island state. And it's only small island states that need to talk about the international order and the international law, because others say might is right. We cannot accept might is right. So for us, you know, it's very, very important that we have the international rule of law. The last point I want to make is that the situation in the Mediterranean is particularly complicated because only 16% of the sea falls within national sovereignty, falls within national jurisdiction. So 84% of the Mediterranean is like the Wild West, and the global criminal networks work through the Mediterranean as much as 30% of global maritime trade passes through the Mediterranean, connecting 3 important continents: Asia, Europe, and Africa.
Thanks, Evarist. To kind of pick up on the small islands and also the center versus periphery distinction which you mentioned there. I think when we turn to the Mediterranean, one of the clearest examples of a kind of crisis that feeds on these tensions between center and periphery is the the migration crisis. And Malta is often described as a frontline state on the central Mediterranean route. There are all these terminologies. So I just wanted to first maybe get your sense of, you know, what dealing with migration means to you, and also then to ask about Malta's record on these issues when we look at responsibilities when it comes to search and rescue, and the allegations, the evidence allegations of Amnesty International, Alarm for a number of these other organizations, that simply what you have is a frontline state like Malta, basically taking their limited resources as a reason to do less than they dutifully should and they can when it comes to rescuing or otherwise aiding endangered people. So how do you respond maybe to those arguments and those claims, and also, you know, what does dealing with migration mean in concrete terms?
So let's start with the big picture first. We are at a time now when in the world it's a record, it's a historical record that we have over 100 million people displaced. It's interesting to know that beyond the hysterical stigmatization of migrants in places like the United States, Canada, and the European Union, most of the migrants are not in the rich countries. Most of the migrants and most of the displaced people and most of the refugees and most of the irregular migrants are in the neighboring countries from where they originate. And they leave their countries, not because they want to leave their countries or for any adventure or simply because they are attracted by a better life. They leave wars, they leave persecution, and in most cases now they are irregular economic migrants. They're leaving because of joblessness, and also what has started and what is going to intensify is they're leaving because of climate change. Huge parts of Africa and huge parts of Asia are becoming uninhabitable. A lot of people who so far work agricultural land are not possible anymore to sustain themselves because they have to leave. They have to leave, and this is going to increase. So definitely, migration has been with us for millennia, and it's going to remain there. It's not a temporary phenomenon. Number two, if we look at Europe, this year we have had so far over 124,000 irregular migrants entering Europe through the Mediterranean. 2/3 of those came through the central Mediterranean route. Central Mediterranean route means Malta and Lampedusa. In our case, we've had, I think, about 360 coming in this year, compared to over 74,000 arriving into Lampedusa, Sicily, and Italy. Interestingly, that in most cases, the biggest numbers, apart from the people coming from Afghanistan and from Syria, the biggest numbers are leaving economic hardship, are leaving joblessness. So it might be the Tunisians, it might be the Bangladeshis. They're looking for a job. They're looking for the possibility to send money back home to be able to feed a family. I'm sure that they would have preferred to stay at home where they were born and they brought up, to live there with their wives and their children. So whatever is said about migrants, and I don't say this in any romantic way or simply to be sentimental, we're dealing with human beings. We're dealing with human beings. And I can tell you personally, my most difficult moments in political life has been dealing with migration, especially when I remember at the beginning of 2020, when for us it was a very painful moment as Malta, COVID. We had thousands arriving in Malta. And please remember that 1,000 arriving in Malta is 1 million arriving in the European Union. Okay, in terms of size and in terms of population and in terms of resources, it means 1 million arriving in the European Union. And that is when it was considered to be a big crisis when 1 million arrived from Syria. I'm saying this not to minimize our responsibility. We have a responsibility, and I was saying it's painful because sometimes the dilemma is, and the choice of policy is, not between right and wrong. Honestly, it's between wrong and wrong, and I'll explain why. And that is very painful to admit that the dilemma, that the moral dilemma is between wrong and wrong. And I will explain why. If we take the last 17 years, over 24,000, we saved over 24,000 in our search and rescue area. Of those 24,000, our European Union partners took just over 2,000, less than 10%. They are not ready to share that responsibility with us. And at this point, I want to make a bit of a digression without being misunderstood, and I want to stress this. I think it was very good for the European Union to be so generous with the Ukrainian refugees. They are fleeing a cruel war, a war which is terrible, an imperialistic war, and it's good that we are helping the millions. The last number that was given, over 8 million have been displaced, more than half of them in the nearby countries. So please, I want to stress this. But if we want to be, human and have no double standards, we should show the same kind of generosity with the Asians and with the Africans trying to enter the European Union. Because we do have double standards, and while countries that had built their own reputation of saying no to refugees, now open their borders to Ukrainians. That is good. But this kind of generosity has not overflown into the issue of refugees and migrants coming from Asia and Africa. At the same time, I must say this, there is a study, and this is not a study that has been carried out by Malta, because in that case, it would be suspected that we are praising ourselves. François Heran, who is a French statistician and runs the National Institute of Statistics there, shows that between 2015 and 2018, given the size of Malta and its resources, it was the #1 EU country that granted most asylum to refugee and asylum seekers, more than Germany. This is a study which is available. Now, saying this, it doesn't mean that the situation is not difficult and is not painful, especially when we have boats, people seeking help. This year we've had over 3,000 who have drowned in the Mediterranean. These statistics are meaningless because probably they are more. It's only what we managed to count. And we've had instances so that's why I said it's a moral dilemma between wrong and wrong, because in our case, the only way we can stop the flow is to cooperate with the Libyan Coast Guards. Now that lands us into another problem, because we still have to manage to persuade the Libyan authorities to accept the involvement of UNHCR in the running of the detention centers so that people are treated decently in those centers. It's very difficult because there is a lot of deep mutual suspicion between the Libyan authorities and organizations like the UNHCR. So that is why I said it's a painful dilemma for us. But our EU partners have not helped us. They are very good at preaching to us what needs to be done. I can tell you, I've had discussions with my Danish colleague, for example, not last summer, but the summer before. And I told him, listen, there are 27 migrants seeking refuge and asylum on a Danish ship. Can't you take 27? And he said, no, 27 is too much. Imagine if it's 27 is too much for Denmark. If we're going to argue like this, it's crazy. And I must say this as well, Jacob. And again, this is not to brush off what the accusations leveled at Malta. Unfortunately, when it comes to migration, left, center, and right, the political rhetoric in most cases is very similar. So it's interesting that at the same time that the UK is trying to negotiate with Rwanda the sending of refugees there to have their application process there. Denmark, now we have a Tory government in the UK. In Denmark, we have a left of center government. They are doing the same. And one thing I want to say, and I think this must be emphasized, between 2015 and 2019, the European Union had Sophia naval mission. It saved over 50,000 people in migrant boats. It was stopped by a number of countries in the European Union because they said it is serving as an incentive for more regular migrants to come to the European Union. It was replaced by Irini naval mission, tasked only with stopping the flow of arms to Libya, and expressly told, if you pick one boat, we will shut you down. So, I mean, this is very, very painful, and this is very, very, very difficult, no? And I honestly don't know when the European Union is going to resolve this. They said that they plan to have a new migration and asylum pact by February 2024. I see no sign of that happening because the two main issues remain. You know, when you save people at sea, how do you save them? Then you disembark them. Where do you disembark them? And then where do you relocate them? So countries in the north are very generous and are telling Spain, Italy, Malta, Cyprus, Greece, you know, pick up the people. And then when you tell them, but are you ready to share responsibility? And we relocate a number of them to you. And I must tell you this, we found some help, and I must praise them, from Germany and from France, and to a certain extent even from Spain. But the other countries will take 6, 10, and sometimes you know how they take them? Very transactional. Listen, we need to have the cyber center of the European Union based in our country. If you vote for us, we'll take 10, we'll take 12. This is how it has happened. And in some cases, and I won't mention countries not to stigmatize them, we've had authorities telling us, yes, we are ready to take 10, but they must be of a certain height. They must be blonde. Honestly, I'm not joking. And they must be white to take them. So you know, I mean, it's painful. And I'm saying this to show how difficult it is. At the same time, with the demographic suicide of the European Union, and the birth rate continuing to go down, whereas the birth rate in Africa is going up. And in 28 years' time, there will be 5 Africans for every European. And in most cases, the European will be middle-aged and old. And in the case of the Africans, they will be children and young people. There are 6 million vacant jobs in the European Union, which they cannot fill. So why not find ways of organizing regular migration, cyclical migration? And we have good examples, like the relationship between Morocco and Spain, for example. So we have on what to build. At the same time, and I know I'll end on this note, at the same time, accepting these migrants in Europe means that it is brain gain for us. A lot of doctors, nurses, and professional people leave Africa every year to come to Europe, How are those societies going to have the necessary talent, the necessary entrepreneurial spirit, the necessary know-how to develop themselves? Because the other side of migration, and this is what we should be discussing, is development and resetting the relationship between Europe and Africa and stopping colonialism by a different name and in different means, which is now increasing because Europe sees Africa primarily as an exporter of primary products. Now, having more gas and oil from there, we are putting Africa again in that role with the hypocrisy of telling them because of climate change, go for green energy, but give us your gas and oil.
So I'd like to ask about about changing the way the European Union relates to Africa and the southern Mediterranean countries as well, and Eastern Mediterranean. So I think a major focus. You mentioned the Libyan Coast Guard and working with them. That policy has come in for quite considerable criticism as well, based on the discrimination and human rights abuses practiced in Libya, as well as the unsafe still context in Libya. So maybe I'd like to ask you about that, and also more broadly, when it comes to European engagement with Africa and other neighborhood states, what role can human rights and these so-called values related European values issues play in that? Does the European Union have a leg to stand on? And even if it has in the past behaved hypocritically towards these countries, and just how expansive should relations become? How many conditions should be removed to change relations between European Union and these countries?
First of all, the issue of treating people decently and humanly is not specifically European. Recently what happened when Borrell said that the European Union is a garden and the rest of the world is a jungle. I mean, okay, he tried to put some makeup on it to change its ugly features, but it remains the same. We still think that we have a right to, even though we are a tiny minority on the planet, we haven't given up on evangelizing the rest of the world. Now we don't use religion, but we use the doctrine of human rights. And I think the best way, I believe that the best way to promote human rights, and we must promote human rights, I do not accept the idea that human rights is either a Western or European sort of achievement and we should spread it to the rest of the world. It is every human being on this planet deserves to live free from fear and from want, both. So, and should enjoy political, social, and economic rights. And in the world, we tend to find it very convenient for the West to emphasize political rights. So freedom of expression, which is very important, freedom to vote, which is very important, but then we don't give that much importance to social and economic rights. In Asia, the opposite happens. It's as if it's important to lift people out of poverty, but then not to give them the political rights of freedom of expression and freedom of association and free election. So I think we should all learn from each other. And the best way to promote democracy and human rights, I repeat, is first to be humble and look at our shortcomings within our own countries, because democracy is not passing through a very good time at this moment in any country. Just take the number of millions of people switching off, which is very worrying. Coming back to the issue, the European Union should work with the African Union. If one were to see what a lot of work the African Union does, even in terms of rights, even in terms of human rights, even in terms of treating people with decency and dignity, we should work together as equal partners. The problem, Jacob, that I see is this, that because of the competition with China, the geopolitical competition with China, there is this compulsion now from the part of the European Union, countries like France especially, to disengage from Africa. They don't admit this and they refuse to accept it. They will disagree and they will say, no, it's not true, but it is true. The European Union continues to ignore Africa and now wants to give more importance to the Indo-Pacific. This is very short-sighted. And one can understand structurally what has happened within the European Union. In the last, I think since the enlargement, what has happened, so we're talking the last 18 years, the epicenter of the European Union has moved towards the east. The south is forgotten, even though there are 1/3 of the European Union members are somehow or other Mediterranean countries. So 1/3, but they do not form a bloc. Yes, the leaders meet once or twice a year, but that is not a bloc. That is not a bloc. And they don't work together, and they don't agree. If you take the policy of Italy and the policy of France regarding Libya, even today, their policies, the bilateral relations with Libya are stronger than the policy of the European Union itself. So that is why one of the reasons why the European Union is paralyzed regarding Libya is because there are still deep divisions within the European Union. But apart from that, what has happened with the enlargement to the east? The eastern countries, you know, the eastern neighborhood and going down from the Baltic down to Bulgaria, they have managed to pull the European Union in that direction. And the agenda is the agenda that they set. To get the Mediterranean, to get Africa, to get Libya discussed in the Foreign Affairs Council of the European Union is a huge achievement. To get it discussed for an hour. So you can imagine what kind of importance we're given. And now I've started to understand this even better. When you talk to people living in the south of Italy, Sardinia, Naples, Sicily, Spain the same, Marseille the same, Greece, most of the leadership in the European Union comes from the north, even within the member states, even within France, even within Italy. So although geographically they are Mediterranean, there is still the issue of the Mezzogiorno, of the south. So the top leadership of these countries, I must say, ignore and neglect even their southern part. So they ignore even more what is more south than their south. So unless, and I think it will be in the interest of the European Union, because as I said, in the years ahead, geographically, I started off as a kind of a joke. Geologically, the two continents move closer 2 centimeters every year. But politically, economically, and socially, they are not moving. They are not moving closer, and if at all, and this is not something that I'm just saying, if you hear people like Romano Prodi, people like Juncker, I mean, not to mention the other leaders that we've had in different countries and in Europe. I mean, not to mention people who had such a Mediterranean vision, like Andreotti, like Moro, you know. It's the European Union, I repeat, is being very short-sighted because there is this obsession that the 21st century is the century of Asia. No, the 21st century is the century of Asia, but also the century of Africa. By the end of this century, 40% of the people in the world will live in Africa. You know, nearly 4 billion people. And it's not going to go away. So the European Union, it's in its interest to look south and to build an equal relationship and partnership with the African countries.
Hi, Evarist. I'm Inigo. I'm the secretary for the Diplomatic Society. And before we open it up to the rest of our members and the people watching, I wanted to ask you, because I found what you were saying very interesting, especially as a Spaniard myself. I understand the issues that Malta faces with regards to migration and sort of the apathy and inaction from Northern European countries. But what I found very interesting about your talk and the title of the talk was the multipolar aspect of Mediterranean relations, right? As you said, 1/3 of member states have some sort of border with the Mediterranean and so on. I was wondering what your definition or what your advice would be to policy planners right now who have to create a cohesive area out of the Mediterranean, especially facing the European Union. What are the sort of policies, key issues that can rally diverse states, Israel, Lebanon, Italy, and Spain together in this sort of Mediterranean multipolar space, as you called it? Is there anything that can bring these countries together? Because what there seems to be right now is a lot of independent issues between Mediterranean states. Is there a way to make it a space that can actually work for people that border the Mediterranean, or is it just going to be a constant source of issues and a struggle?
Well, even 50 years ago, when Brodel published his book on the history of the Mediterranean, he was saying that the Mediterranean speaks with many voices. Now I think we scream at each other with a lot of different voices, because wherever you look, there is a lot of tension. There is a lot of conflict. Number one, no power in the world, including the United States or China or Russia, is in a position to impose its hegemony on the Mediterranean. That is definitely gone. Even if you look at the European Union, I was saying it's supposed to have a common foreign security policy. It doesn't. Even if you take some issues like Libya, like Turkey, how to deal with Turkey, different countries have different positions. So even the bloc does not speak with one voice. Go to NATO, the same thing happens. Look at Greece, look at Turkey. They are in the same alliance, but they speak they don't speak a lot, unfortunately. They shout a lot at each other with different voices. The Eastern Mediterranean is full of tension. We have the relationship between Greece, Turkey, Cyprus, Egypt, Israel. No need to tell you that it is such a shame that more Palestinians are being killed every day, but it hardly makes the news. The Palestinian issue has been wiped off the agenda, and it's still there. And if we think that by ignoring issues we can pretend that they're not there, or that we can fashion this kind of policy which you're asking for without addressing these tensions and these painful issues, we will not. So the first thing we have to do is to be honest and, admit what our problems are. The first way to try to address a problem, I wouldn't say solve a problem, is at least to admit that it is still a problem. So now the tensions, and why I say that the Mediterranean is multipolar, because it has remained a global sea. It is not the first time. It is not the first time that the death of the Mediterranean has been declared. And, it's like the death of Mark Twain, very exaggerated. And it has not died. It remains a global sea. And it remains a global sea, even in terms of the trade that passes through it. And as I said before, connecting Asia, Africa, and Europe. So even when we say that the Indo-European, the Indo-Pacific is very important, it's very important, but it's only part of the world. And it is connected to the Mediterranean as well. So we need to address the issues that there are and see whether we are ready to really work at them. But as I said, today, all the main players are in the Mediterranean. China with its Belt and Road Initiative, the United States has largely disengaged from the area and from Africa, but still tries to operate in a different way. Russia, for the first time, Russia has a base in the Mediterranean. Gaddafi used to be castigated and attacked for a lot of things. He never gave Russia a base in the Mediterranean. Now you have the base in Syria, and you have the very important air base in Jufra, in Libya, and with the presence of Wagner in Mali and in Libya, you have a whole corridor from Mali, from the heart of Africa, to the Mediterranean, to Benghazi. So these are the big geopolitical changes that have happened, and the presence of Turkey. You cannot solve, you cannot resolve the Libyan issue without Turkey and without Russia. So you cannot. I mean, we are very good at, as the European Union, to go to Tripoli and have a press conference and say how much we are spending on the southern neighborhood. And it is true, The amount of millions and billions of euros that the European Union spends in the southern neighborhood and in Africa are huge. But what are we getting out of it? You know, what kind of geopolitical leverage and what kind of policy? We are absent. Because after the press conference, we leave, and those who remain on the ground are Turkey and Russia. And please, let us keep this in mind when it comes to Turkey and Libya. In 2019, Libya asked 5 countries to help it face the attack from Haftar, from the east. You know, it asked Italy, France, it asked the UK, Algeria, and Turkey. Turkey answered and went there. So, you know, one has to decide what to do, because once you leave a vacuum, and the European Union has left a vacuum in these countries, it is then filled by others. And I repeat, if the European Union is not to be involved in the shaping of the destiny of the Mediterranean and of Africa, others will shape it, not just without the European Union, but against the European Union.
Perfect. Thank you very much for that. And if we could now open it up to everyone else that's watching and members for both societies.
Please, as a young diplomat, don't give up hope, though. Eh? We cannot have hope. Things are always very difficult, but we must not become cynical. And please always keep in mind what good Viktor Frankl says. The world is in a bad state, but it will become worse if we do not do our best.
Yeah, completely agreed. And in that spirit, if anyone wants to ask a question on how to fix it, or just on Mr. Bartolo's experience, you can either put in a question on the group, on the chat, or just raise your hand and we'll unmute you so you can ask any question you want. I will just wait a few seconds for that. Yeah, so if there's any questions, just put your hand up or put them in the chat.
Can I add something else? Something else? Again, I will refer to Brodel, because I think he remains a very important, I think, point of reference for us to try and understand the Mediterranean. But at the same time, he warns us not to be dogmatic and not to be Brodelian. He himself changed what he taught in the light of emerging new evidence and new historical facts. But I like what he says, and I think this applies also for diplomacy, not just for historians. First of all, he says, all history must be mobilized if one would understand the present. And I think one of the big problems of modern diplomacy is that we do not have the patience and the time to try to understand the problems that we are facing. You know, we rush to jump to conclusions and to take positions without really trying to understand the other side. I think it's very sad that apparently quite a lot of Ministry of Foreign Affairs around the world are spending less in the professional development of diplomats. And good diplomats need to know geography, need to know history, need to know economics, need to know culture, need to know languages. But less money is being spent on diplomacy. Unfortunately, more money is being spent on arms. And I think one of the biggest problems that we are facing now is that foreign affairs ministers are playing a secondary role when it comes to foreign policy because the defense ministers have taken over. So it's the continuation of war by other means, unfortunately, you know. But what I wanted to point out is that Brodel tells us that history may be divided into three movements: what moves rapidly, what moves slowly, and what appears not to move at all. As good diplomats, we must be aware of all those three layers. Most of the time we spend our attention on the history, maybe, you know, on the what moves rapidly. And what moves rapidly is very much superficial. We give a lot of importance to leaders and what they do, you know, and is that leader crazy because he's doing what he's doing? If we really understand the geography of that place, the history of that place, the culture of that place, you know, we wouldn't make such superficial judgments, and then perhaps we would be able to understand each other more. And classical diplomacy used to be built on the ability to see you know, the situation from the eyes, not of the other side, but also from the eyes of the enemy. And I'd like to share with you, I don't know whether you are familiar with the work of Basil Liddell-Hart. Basil Liddell-Hart is a military historian. He has written very interesting books, especially one of them is Advice to Statesmen. And in this Advice to Statesmen, which unfortunately I think hasn't been followed a lot, he says, and I'll read it word for word because it's very interesting. He says this: keep strong, if possible. In any case, keep cool. Have unlimited patience. Never corner an opponent, and always assist him to save his face. Put yourself in his shoes so as to see things through his eyes. Avoid self-righteousness like the devil. Nothing is so self-blinding. Nothing is so self-blinding. I think it's still very, very good advice. And I think, unfortunately, the lack of this kind of approach and attitude, which means is that you don't capitulate or you don't give up your position. But, you know, if we're not going to find ways of getting along with each other, of learning to live together, not as lovers or as friends or as, but, you know, we are at a very dangerous crossroads. A lot of issues today, we discuss migration, if we discuss pandemics, if we discuss, you know, climate change, cannot be solved without some form of global cooperation. And at this time, the least that we see is some form of global cooperation to face these big issues. And unless we find ways of facing them, we're on the risk of really, you know, bringing human life on this planet to a very dangerous times. Especially now that I see a lot of efforts to try and make nuclear war as acceptable, that it is possible to have a nuclear war and that the world will survive because we will use so-called tactical weapons. So we kill the world with a whimper, not with a bang, but we will still kill it.
Okay, sorry about that.
Okay.
So I'm going to combine a question from the chat with sort of one I had in mind. So you are no longer in frontline politics since the election this earlier this year in Malta. So is there a freedom which comes with being a former politician, maybe, and maybe specifically one working on international issues? So how do you deal with the critique, maybe that former politicians seem to find a new voice when they leave mainstream politics, and the criticism that they should have done more when they were in politics? And the question about the very popular podcast here in the UK, Alistair Campbell, Rory Stewart, these two veterans who are now from yeah.
One of the few to really be honest and express this was Tony Benn, and especially if you read his last volume of his autobiography, which the name says it all, Free at Last. He said, now that I have left politics, I can do politics, really. And he wasn't being cynical. Obviously, when we are in organizations and when we have constraints of office and official posts, you cannot simply say what you think because you are part of a bigger entity and you have to face a lot of different constraints. It doesn't mean that you have lost your voice or that you didn't have a voice or that you didn't say the things that you were saying. But obviously, not being responsible anymore in terms of being constrained by an official position, you can speak for yourself because you will not be speaking for a government or for a country or for a party or for an organization. But it doesn't mean that then you can simply, I think the best way for us to deal, politicians like myself who have been in politics for 30 years, parliamentary and party politics more than 40 years, is not simply, to change persona and all of a sudden, from a devil in politics, you become an angel in post-politics. It's not as simple as that. I was particularly struck once meeting Kenneth Baker, who was the education minister under Thatcher. I met him in London because I was very interested in his project of bringing together good vocational education and good academic education to prepare people for the real world and for the skills that are needed for the 21st century. And when I met him, he smiled at me and he said, listen, what I'm doing with this project is I'm trying to undo the damage I did as a minister, So there are things that we have to face. It's important that even in the world after politics, then we still try to speak, knowing that reality can be quite stubborn and can be quite difficult to change. But at the same time, we cannot afford not to keep on trying.
Thanks so much, Evarist. So the next question is about, bring it back to history and your background as an educator. So are there some structural issues you think with the way history and maybe national histories particularly are taught in different countries? And so how do you feel about do you think the experience people go through of education in history narrows their viewpoints and the way they interact with others, particularly people from the rest of the world? Do you think that needs to change? Is it really an education problem?
Yes, it is, but it's more than education, because we know that in the building of a nation state, the historical narrative plays a very important role. So you have a lot of competing narratives, and to be realistic, it cannot be different. I mean, for people even if you take just a family, the narratives of the different members of that family would be different when they start talking about, what they've passed through and how they see themselves and their identity. I think what is important today is to have what I would call a combination of inclusive nationalism, because I think it is important. The idea of national identity is important, because otherwise if we give up on that, the populists will have a field day. The extreme right wing will have a field day, because it is as if only they talk for the country and for the nation state. And we must understand, and I think this is also part of the issue of migration, why migration is treated so toxically, is that we must, I think, understand that in living in the 21st century is very tough. I would call us that we have become existential nomads. We have lost our comfort zone. All of us have lost our comfort zone. When people lose their comfort zone, they become very dangerous because you still try to find anchors to keep you rooted, to keep you, you know, I mean, you've lost what is familiar. And other people have come in from different cultures, different religions, different color of skin. They have also lost their comfort zone because they have left the country where they were born and where they were brought up. So now this idea of very uncomfortable zones that societies have become must be managed very well. We are not doing enough in a lot of different countries, not just in Malta. We're not doing enough. That it is possible to love your country, what you term as your country, because even there you have a lot of myths and you have a lot of fables of what your country is, without hating others. So I prefer the approach of people like Amartya Sen, for example, to talk about plural identities. For example, I have been asked, how do you feel to be Maltese? Are you European? How do you feel you're European? And I say, if I want to be honest, the best way to explain what my identity is, that I'm European, Mediterranean, and African. And African because, you know, every country in the world, every community in the world has been formed and shaped, not only through its internal dynamics, but also through its interaction with other countries. I mean, if you take a small state like Malta, we're probably quite unique in the world in terms of more than 25% of our population is coming from more than 150 countries. I don't think there's any other country in the world. I don't think there is any other country in the world where you have such a concentration. Remember that Malta is one of the heaviest, densely populated country in the world. We're as if we're living in a pressure cooker, bringing together, I would say, Pozzallo, Barcelona, and Singapore, because you have three things together: irregular migration, you have tourists, and you have migrants to come and work here. When you have such a combination and you don't work to somehow or other build an inclusive identity of what you are, so history must be taught, not as a, you know, that national histories cannot be taught as standalones. If they are taught in terms of how they are in the region and how they relate to the region and to the rest of the world, I think we would have less chauvinism. But it's not easy. I remember there was a project more than 50 years ago to write a common history book for Europe. Can you imagine when the historians sat down to talk about the wars and the big conflicts that there were on finding a narrative? It's very tough, but we must find a way of doing that. I was particularly impressed by the publication. I'm jumping over to New York now, to the Museum of Modern Art. The Museum of Modern Art, I think last year, celebrated 70 years since it opened. And they said that it was very interesting that at first, what they accepted as exhibits and as proper art, wonder of wonders, were only those produced by white men. And white men coming from very, very central countries, mainly the UK and the US. After 70 years, they've learned that you cannot have, and I will read from their introduction, which is called Reimagining the Modern. Sorry, it wasn't 70 years, it was 90 years It was 90 years. And they said, in our museum now, we try to bring together different civilizations, not to destroy each other, but to live together. But it is not easy at all. And in their essay, Reimagining the Modern, they say that it is made clear that the complex fabric of multiple histories cannot be captured in a universal perspective or a single comprehensive account. You know, a one-size-fits-all narrative conceals the dominant perspective of the person who creates it and relegates to the periphery individuals, communities, and geographical areas considered marginal. So in our narratives of our communities, it would be a mistake to say the nation is not important, or your village is not important, or your city is not important, but to try and achieve what is difficult, but I think is the only way forward, to link all these different layers together. You know, I think James Joyce was looking so far ahead when he gave the address of his hero, Stephen, starting with Dublin. And the last word was the world. But we cannot jump any link there. So it is the village or the city where you live, it's the region where you live, it's the country where you live, it's the geographical area where you live, it's the world. But, you know, we have to combine all those different layers together. I know it's tough, but life is not easy.
Thanks so much, Evarist. I'm conscious we're about 10 minutes over, so
I'm going to charge you more.
But so basically, I wanted to close, leading on from that point about we need to have a kind of understanding of national histories that is in some way also cosmopolitan, in the sense of aware of the connections and the different influences. I guess one kind of expression of idealism historically has been the United Nations. And I'm conscious that Malta will be taking up a seat at the UN Security Council for the next 2 years. Now, there are many verdicts going around. The UN in general and the Security Council in particular are not fit for purpose, that they've just become a talking shop and deadlock, particularly with Russia on the Security Council. So what advice would you give to, say, Malta's representatives on the council? Does it matter what they say? Is that forum a useful one to maybe promote those ideas that you've discussed today?
I'm a great advocate of the United Nations, like also of the Organization for Cooperation and Security in Europe. I'm a great believer in multilateral organizations, but we cannot blame them because they reflect what the countries constituting them want of them. And I like quoting two proverbs when we discuss organizations like the United Nations. You know, there's the English proverb that a bad workman blames his tools. So instead of saying that we are bad workmen, how to use the United Nations, we blame the United Nations. And there's a very strong Russian proverb which says, if your face is ugly, don't blame the mirror. So what is happening with the United Nations is that we're not using it well, and we're not, you know, we're not being good in how it's used. Russia, but even others, you know, the idea that what was built after the Second World War still expresses today's world, when on the Security Council, you have no one from Africa, you know, as a permanent member, from Latin America, you know, and then it's still dominated by United States, Europe, apart from Russia and China. It has to change, but the 5 permanent members are not ready to give up their veto. I don't think it's only China that is not, sorry, Russia that is not ready to give up its veto. I mean, let's admit it. I mean, Wouldn't it be nice if France was a bit more European and decided to give its seat to the European Union instead of holding it itself, and like that make the European Union a major geopolitical player? It's not ready. So multilateral organizations will succeed as long as their members, and especially the major powers in them, want them to succeed. And talking on this, the same applies for the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. It's not fair that those organizations are not sensitive enough to small states and developing countries. Mia Motley makes a brilliant point when she says, we are suffering from the climate change. We need to finance our energy transition for a problem that we have not caused. The climate crisis has not been caused by the developing countries, has not been caused by small states, but they have to pay for the energy transition. And she says, they give us conditions where we have to redeem our loan in 7 years, 10 years. She says, is that fair? When the UK is still, only till a few years ago, was still paying off its loan of the First World War, 100 years later. Germany is still paying its loan of the Second World War. You know, so why not have similar conditions for small countries, for developing countries to be able to finance this energy transition? Going back to Malta's role, yes, once you are on the Security Council, a lot of countries approach you to consult and to work with you to see what issues you're going to bring up. Malta's voice will be there with the others, and I hope that we stand up to what we believe in. We discuss with other countries as much as we can, but we must be the voice of those who are not on the Security Council. And even though we're a small voice, but once we're there, if we do our work properly, and I think this is very important, if we are serious in what we do, we think well of what we say and what we present, yes, we will not be taken for granted.
Evarist, thank you so much for your time and for such a wide-ranging conversation. And thank you to everyone who joined us for this. So we're going to sign off now. And
thank you. All the best. All the best.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.